The Patchwork Bride by Sandra Dallas in Chapter 10. A little bit of background noise, but I hope it'll be okay. Because I'm sitting out here on the porch reading. It's just really nice. Chapter 10. When Ellen was finished telling the story of Nell and Buddy, June leaned forward in her chair and asked, "She left? Just like that?" Stupid, wasn't it? She should have stayed and worked it out, but she was too stubborn. Did Buddy go after her? No, and that made her mad too. She realized later that he didn't know where she was because she'd asked her aunt not to tell him. Nell had returned to her grandparents' farm in Kansas, Ellen explained. The farm was home. She might have gone to a city, but she needed to go to be where she felt loved and safe. Besides, Nell wasn't so adventurous anymore. She wanted to sleep in her own bed and wake up to the sounds of cows and chickens. She'd always loved chickens. Ellen paused and looked out at one of her own chickens that was pecking at the dirt. They wouldn't have chickens if she and Ben moved into Durango. They'd have to eat more store-bought eggs from Piggly Wiggly and the chickens that had been killed and plucked in a factory. They'd taste like cardboard. Damn grocery stores, she thought. Ellen moved her chair to get out of the sun. It was midday now, and the sky was cloudless, the sun very hot. An apartment wouldn't have a porch either. Where would she go to cool off from the summer heat? She'd probably have to depend on that wretched air conditioning people were starting to put in. You couldn't even open the windows in some of those places. The veranda was one of the first things she and Ben had added to their honeymoon cabin. Except in the winter, they sat there almost every evening looking out at the stars. Ben would talk about cattle prices, ask her opinion on improvements, because their marriage had always been a partnership. Sometimes they didn't agree, and they'd argue loud enough that Maria would come outside and shush them. But sooner or later, one of them would give in, and there would be peace. Ellen almost missed those nights, the time she had win Ben over to her way of thinking, or Ben would convince her he was right. They would make up and know that they really did beat with one heart. When the children were young, they played on the porch, galloping back and forth on stick horses, and when they were older, they honed their roping skills on chairs and tables. The veranda was their rumpus room. The children did their homework there too. Ellen remembered how John had filled out his college applications form. Application forms at a table on the porch. She had been sitting there when he had came in from the mailbox one afternoon with the letter saying he had been accepted at Harvard. Although the nights were cold now, Ellen and Ben still sat on the veranda after dinner, watching the sunsets streak the sky with violent swaths of purple and orange and pink. Ben would remember times long past, and they'd call each other by pet names they hadn't used in years. Sometimes they didn't need to talk. They just sat and held hands. Buddy and Nell might have worked things out, I suppose, but they were both too stubborn. Ellen continued, setting her sewing on the table. She had stitched while she told the story, intricate embroidery stitches that covered the seams between the patches of fabric. "Like you?" June asked. "Oh, no, she was much worse," Ellen smiled as she ran her hand over a patch from a silk gown, a wedding dress that had been in the family. Maybe she shouldn't have cut it up, but some of the silk was split. The top was shredded and only part of the skirt was any good. What was the point of keeping it? A second chicken came along, and the women watched as the two chickens fought over a worm. They squawked. The first chicken triumphed, and the other walked away. There was an afternoon train out of Las Vegas, and Nell barely made it, Ellen said, going back to her story. You have to wonder what would have happened if she had missed it. She might have changed her mind, or Buddy might have come after her. Of course, neither of those things happened. Did she believe they'd make up somehow, and she'd marry him after all? No, Ellen said, shaking her head. After Nell was home, she realized it was over. There had been too many hurtful words. Once she was back in Kansas, Nell knew she'd never marry Buddy after what they'd said to each other. She wouldn't be happy with someone who felt he had the right to tell her what to do, Ellen said. Like me? June asked. Ellen thought a moment. That's for you and Dave to decide. Nell had other complications, she explained. She'd pretty much convinced herself that Buddy didn't really love her, and that maybe after what had happened in that cabin, he no longer respected her. She knew that ranching is lonely work, and that Buddy wanted a wife. Maybe Buddy chose her because she was strong and worked hard. Nell was aware that there were other girls if she turned him down. There are men who think one woman is pretty much like another. And then, of course, Alice was waiting in the wings, Ellen said, staring into the distance. Nell convinced herself of a lot of things. What became of Buddy? June asked. Did he survive the war? Yes, Ellen replied. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few weeks, and there weren't all that many men in the fighting, or that many casualties. In fact, some soldiers never even made it to Cuba before the war ended. All war is awful, she said, but Buddy's war was short, so it wasn't as bad as the 2 world wars with all their carnage. Or Korea. Nell glanced at her granddaughter when she mentioned Korea, but June didn't react. You know, of course, that Theodore Roosevelt, who was the second in command of the Rough Riders, became president. Maybe Buddy went to Washington with him. Was his picture ever in the paper? Ellen shook her head. Not that I know of. Maybe he came looking for her after the war. He hadn't, because he didn't know where she'd gone, Ellen said. Lucy might have told him, but she died not long after Nell left, kicked in the head by a horse. Nell might have gone back for the funeral, but it was a long time before she learned what had happened to her aunt, and by then it was too late. Lucy never married Mr. Archer? No, it's funny. He might have married her, but she held out. Maybe Lucy giving Nell the dress she'd once intended for her own wedding was like admitting that she'd never marry again. Lucy was awfully independent. Like Nell? Do you think Nell was really independent? Oh, she moved out west to live on a ranch in New Mexico, but she was after a husband. That was the main reason she went there, and that was why she moved on later. Ellen twisted her embroidery thread to make a French knot. What happened to Buddy? Oh, he married all right. Just then the screen banged and Maria came out and asked if they wanted their dinner on the porch. Ellen pushed aside the quilt and stood, saying that would be nice. It wouldn't be long before it would be too cold to eat outside. June and I can fetch it. I'll do it. You're supposed to take it easy. June, you make sure your grandma don't work too hard. The doctor says for her to rest. Oh, hell, I'm not an invalid, Ellen said. Sometimes you treat Mr. Ben and me like we've got one foot in the grave. Well, Maria crossed herself. Ellen waved her hand. Don't rub it in. We still have 1 foot out of the grave. If I'm going to die, I don't want to do it while I'm sitting in a chair. Maria threw up her hands and went back inside. June asked her grandmother, Is your heart that bad? No, of course not. I just have to take my pills and be careful climbing stairs. The doctor won't let me on a horse anymore. So you don't ride? Ellen didn't answer. Granny? Your grandfather doesn't understand when I tell him I'm supposed to stay off horses. Just the day before, Ben had saddled Ellen's mare and had shown up at the kitchen door with the horse. When Ellen told him she wasn't supposed to ride, he looked as hurt as if she'd slapped him in the face. He said he wanted to ride out to the creek and there wasn't anybody else to go with him. Lord, June had thought she couldn't let him go alone. He'd have ridden into the next county and she would have never found him. So you went with him? Ellen shrugged. Somebody has to look after him. They'd had a nice time, too. Ellen had asked Maria to fix a picnic, and they spread an old quilt on the ground under a cottonwood and eaten the lunch. Then Ben had napped on the quilt, his hat over his face, while Ellen took off her boots and put her toes into the cold water. It was a nice outing, as they had had in a long time. When Ben woke up, he thought for a moment it was 50 years earlier, not long after they moved to the ranch. They had made love in that very spot. He seemed to remember and reached for her hand, and they sat holding hands until supper time. Maria feared that Ellen had been bucked off her horse and Ben had wandered away to get help. She was ready to send Wesley to search for them when they finally showed up. "Can't Maria take over some of your work?" June asked. "She already has, but there's just so much she can do. She can barely read and write. There's no way the housekeeper could keep books and fill out government forms. After all the years she lived with them, Maria didn't know a thing about beef except how to cook it." "What about Wesley?" June asked. Ellen smiled. "He's as loyal and honest and hard-working as the day is long, and there's nothing he wouldn't do for us. But would you trust him to run a ranch?" "At least he can read and write." "Can he?" "I see your point." June held the door, and the two of them followed Maria into the big kitchen. It was Ellen's favorite room in the sprawling ranch house. The man from Sears Roebuck who designed kitchens had drawn up a plan with metal cupboards and a linoleum floor. It looked like something from a woman's magazine, not like a real ranch kitchen. Ellen had thrown away all the drawing and hired a carpenter to make a big wooden cupboard. She'd put in a countertop of bright Mexican tiles, some of them broken now, and a wood floor that had been worn down over the years by hundreds, maybe thousands of boots. There was a pantry with bins that held 100-pound sacks of flour and sugar, a freezer big enough to accommodate an entire beef or maybe two, a stove with 6 burners, and a dishwasher. The heart of the kitchen was the scrub-top wooden table that could seat a dozen, and during roundup there were often that many men gathered around it. Ellen had found the table at a ranch sale. Then she'd picked up old pressed wood chairs that nobody wanted anymore. They were sturdy enough that a man could lean back in one until it rested on 2 legs and not fall over. Maria went to the stove and stirred a big pot of chili with a long wooden spoon. She tasted it and nodded her satisfaction. "It's not too hot for you?" she said. "I'm not an invalid, Maria," Ellen told her. "I don't want chili that tastes like junket. You can't make a chili that's too hot for me." Maria waved away the insult as she dished up bowls of meat and beans and sprinkled cheese on top. She wrapped hot tortillas in a towel, then set everything on a tray. "Will Grandpa Ben be back in time to eat with us?" June asked. "He won't be back till late afternoon. I imagine he'll have his dinner in Durango. He should be home by supper time." Ellen hoped so at any rate. Ben was liable to start jawing with the vet about horses and bulls that were long dead and lose track of time. He could be stubborn when Wesley insisted he get back into the truck. "Who works for who?" he asked more than once. That was why Ellen generally took her husband into town on errands. She could argue him down. "Well, good, because that gives you time to tell me about the other 2 weddings your friend ran away from." Ellen started to pick up the tray, but Maria elbowed her aside and said, "My job, too heavy for you, old woman." "I'm no older than you," Ellen replied, although Maria was 25 years younger. Still, she let Maria carry the tray. The doctor had told her not to lift heavy things. She smiled at the housekeeper, who had been with her for more than 20 years. Ben had found Maria hiding in the barn with a young boy. They were illegals and scared to death, he told Ellen. She asked could they sleep in the hay, but it wasn't right when we have a place inside where she can sleep. No, Ellen agreed that it wouldn't be right. She remembered a neighbor who had found Mexicans hiding in one of his sheds and had driven them out with a pitchfork. I told her they could stay the night in the foreman's cabin since it's empty. The night? Ellen asked. Maybe a little longer. Ellen was sure it would be a lot longer. Ben was soft-hearted. He'd never been able to shoot a horse with a broken leg, and one of the hands had had to do it for him. He was always bringing home stray puppies and kittens. Maria and her son were more than homeless animals, so Ellen and Ben made the two feel at home, and before long, Ellen knew they would be part of the ranch as long as they wanted to. 2 years ago, the boy had been drafted into the Army, but he had promised to come back when he was mustered out and work as a cowhand. At least he would if Ben and Ellen still owned the ranch. Ellen wondered what Maria would do if they sold the place. They wouldn't have room for a cook and housekeeper in an apartment. And what about Wesley and Darrell, the other cowboy who'd been with them for decades? They were getting along in years too, and with mechanization, there wasn't so much employment for ranch hands, not the way it used to be when cowboys drifted from ranch to ranch, always looking for better jobs. Where would Wesley and Darrell go? June and her grandmother followed the cook outside as Maria set the food on the table. June snatched away the quilt. Just what we need, spilling chili on this. She brushed yellow cottonwood leaves off a chair and set Ellen stitching on it. I wonder if Nell ever forgot Buddy, June said after Maria went inside. Ellen shook her head. I wouldn't think so. You never forget first love. She glanced at her granddaughter, who was looking off toward the barn, thinking. Maybe I've done a stupid thing, June mused. I should have stayed and talked to Dave after we both calmed down. Running off like that was foolish, wasn't it? It seems like I was just as impulsive as your friend Nell. But Dave is always so sure of himself. He'd have tried to convince me I was wrong. I didn't want him making the decision for me. Granny, I couldn't go through with it. I just couldn't. Do you think I was wrong? There's not a right or wrong to it. If I don't marry him, do you think I'll regret it later? Sometimes, if you marry him, you'll always wonder what would have happened if you hadn't. And if you don't marry him, you'll still have what-ifs. Nell had a lot of what-ifs. 3 of them. Remember, she ran away 3 times. The second man was James. And he tried to tell her what to do? Not exactly. She left him for an entirely different reason, and it didn't have a thing to do with stubbornness. What happened with him? Ellen sat back on the bench and pushed away her bowl. Then she picked up a fork and took a bite of the Mexican chocolate cake that Maria had made. The icing was as thick as the cake. The doctor had told Ellen to watch her diet, but she didn't. Why deprive herself if she was going to die anyway? She asked him. He hadn't had an answer. James Hamilton was the second man Nell was engaged to, and oh my, was he a looker. Was he like Buddy? Not in the least. In fact, he looked just like that young actor we saw in the movie in Durango when you and Dave were here last summer. Van Johnson. He was blond and freckle-faced. He was the picture of the all-American boy. You could have put his face on Saturday Evening Post cover. Ellen used the tines of her fork to catch the cake crumbs on her plate, thinking she'd like a second piece. Maybe Nell was attracted to him because he didn't seem at all like Buddy, and he seemed like prime marriage material. Don't forget, she was still looking for a husband. She was a lot more serious about it this time. the end of chapter 10.